At 11:45 in the morning on August 17, 1943, American bombers appeared over Regensburg, Germany. To the Germans, the sight made no sense. The aircraft had taken off from England more than 6 hours earlier. According to every range chart the Luftwaffe trusted, those bombers should have turned back hundreds of miles before reaching Bavaria. Their fuel should have forced them to abort over occupied France. Instead, 230 B-17 Flying Fortresses crossed deep into Germany, struck a major Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, then continued south, over the Alps, across the Mediterranean, and into North Africa. They did not return to England. They kept going. And in doing so, they executed one of the most daring bomber operations of the war. German commanders demanded an explanation. American bombing doctrine did not seem to allow such a mission. Yet somehow, the impossible had happened. Inside the war room at 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe, England, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the constant hum of fans struggling to clear it. Large maps covered the walls. Colored threads stretched across them, marking the routes flown by American bombers over the Channel, across the Low Countries, and into Germany. Every thread ended the same way. They stopped before the deepest industrial targets. They stopped where escort fighters ran out of fuel. It was the summer of 1943, and the combined bomber offensive was not yet winning. In truth, it was barely surviving. Raids against targets like Schweinfurt and Ploiești were producing losses measured in double-digit percentages. Some operations cost more aircraft than the factories they damaged were worth in immediate effect. The arithmetic was becoming impossible. The planners understood it. The crews felt it. And the Germans certainly recognized it. In Washington, General Henry H. Hap Arnold sat behind a desk buried beneath combat reports. As commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, Arnold carried a vision larger than any single operation. He answered upward to George Marshall, to President Roosevelt, and indirectly to Churchill and the combined chiefs of staff. But beneath politics and command structures, he answered to something even harsher. The mathematics of industrial war. Arnold believed deeply in strategic bombing. He believed that American heavy bombers, flown in daylight with precision, could cripple German industry, shorten the war, and ultimately save lives. But belief did not solve engineering problems. Belief did not extend fighter range. Belief did not bring crews home. Arnold was not a dreamer in uniform. He was a hard pragmatist who had spent his life around machines. He had flown in the age of the Wright brothers. He had survived early aviation, when engines failed without warning and airframes could come apart in flight. He understood range, fuel load, maintenance, and fatigue as well as any operational planner in the service. And he knew exactly what was strangling the bomber offensive. American bombers could reach the Ruhr, but only just. They could push toward Munich in theory, but not reliably, and certainly not while expecting to return safely to England. The doctrine was clear. Heavy bombers would fly in daylight. They would stay in tight combat boxes for mutual defensive fire. They would rely on altitude, speed, and the Norden bombsight to achieve precision. Escort fighters would accompany them only as far as fuel permitted. Then the fighters would turn back. The bombers would continue alone. And deep inside Germany, the Luftwaffe would be waiting. German fighters had time to climb, form, and attack in carefully coordinated waves. Anti-aircraft gunners knew the bomber routes and altitudes. The result was attrition on a scale no amount of courage could offset. Arnold studied loss reports knowing exactly what each percentage meant. Not numbers. Men. Each bomber lost meant 10 airmen gone. Dead, wounded, captured, or missing. He read intelligence estimates showing German fighter production rising instead of collapsing. He read memoranda from Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, requesting more aircraft, more escort, better weather, and more time. Time to build strength. Time to refine tactics. Time that Germany was also using. By the summer of 1943, two realities were colliding. The first was the belief that strategic bombing could break Germany by destroying its industrial base. The second was the brutal evidence that unescorted bombers could not survive long enough over deep targets to make that theory work. Arnold stood between those two truths. He had promised results. He had defended the bomber offensive against naval skeptics, Army ground commanders, and every strategist who believed resources should go elsewhere. He could not afford to be wrong. The central problem was always the same: range. The P-47 Thunderbolt was powerful, rugged, and deadly, but its combat radius was too short. It could escort bombers to the German border, perhaps slightly beyond, and then it had to turn back. The P-38 Lightning had longer range, but there were fewer of them in Europe, and maintenance problems in the cold, damp climate reduced reliability. Everyone wanted the same answer: a true long-range escort fighter. But in the summer of 1943, that answer did not yet exist in meaningful numbers. So the bombers kept going alone. They flew in formations of hundreds, each bristling with 50 caliber machine guns. They flew with discipline and courage. And they came back with holes in their wings, engines smoking, wounded men in the fuselage, and too many empty spaces in formation. Some did not come back at all. Arnold knew he could not simply wait for better aircraft, better weather, or perfect conditions. The invasion of Europe was already in planning. The Soviets were bleeding on the Eastern Front and demanding relief. The Allied chiefs had committed themselves to breaking German industrial strength before the ground invasion came. That meant deeper raids. It meant bigger risks. And it meant pushing beyond what the enemy believed possible. The idea that emerged was radical. If the bombers could not safely fly to a deep target and return to England, then perhaps they should not return to England at all. What if they struck deep into Germany and then kept going? What if they landed in North Africa instead? A shuttle mission. England to Germany to North Africa. One way across the continent. The concept effectively doubled the useful reach of the bomber force. It opened targets previously considered inaccessible. It forced German air defenses to think in two directions at once and stretched fighter interception plans across a wider geography. The idea itself was not entirely new. Variations had been discussed before, but discussion was one thing. Execution was another. The logistical burden was enormous. Fuel and ammunition had to be pre-positioned in North Africa. Maintenance crews had to be ready. Whether over Germany, the Alps, and the Mediterranean all had to cooperate. Navigation had to be almost flawless. There would be no comfortable margin for error. A crew that got lost, delayed, or badly damaged would not have a familiar English airfield to limp back to. Even Eaker was cautious. He had already lost too many crews to sign off lightly on something that layered new risks on top of old ones. But Arnold saw more than danger. He saw opportunity. He saw a way to prove that range was not an absolute prison. That doctrine could bend. That American air power, applied with enough discipline and imagination, could do what the enemy believed impossible. To lead the mission, the planners chose Colonel Curtis Emerson LeMay. At 36 years old, LeMay did not look like a man destined for legend. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to sleep. His face was broad and often unreadable. He chewed unlit cigars. He wasted neither words nor gestures. He had already built a reputation on two things. He got results, and he brought bombers home. LeMay did not believe in luck. He believed in fuel calculations, navigation discipline, and tight formation flying. He believed that bomber crews survived not through heroics, but through rigor. If the bombers flew straight and level through flak during the bomb run, the bombardier had a chance to hit the target. If they zigzagged or broke formation, they wasted fuel, scattered their bombs, and increased their chances of being picked off. His crews hated the straight, exposed approach. They did it anyway, because LeMay's groups consistently suffered lower losses than many others. He had trained as a navigator, and it showed in everything he did. He understood dead reckoning, wind drift, and the way small directional errors turned into catastrophe over long distances. He believed crews got lost less from ignorance than from indiscipline, trusting instinct instead of instruments, flying by feel instead of by calculation. LeMay drilled navigation until it became reflex. He flew with his men, not above them in abstraction. He knew exactly what a bomber smelled like 6 hours into a mission: oil smoke, sweat, stale oxygen, and cold metal. When the Regensburg, North Africa shuttle raid was approved, LeMay was selected to lead the first wave. Not simply because he was senior, but because if the mission was possible at all, he was the man least likely to deviate from the plan. He would not panic. He would not turn back early. He would not let formation discipline collapse. The target was Regensburg, home to one of the major Messerschmitt Bf 109 production plants. The concept of the mission sounded almost straightforward on paper. Take off from England. Fly southeast across the Channel and occupied Europe. Bomb Regensburg. Continue south over the Alps. Cross the Mediterranean. Land in North Africa. In practice, it was a brutal demand on machines and men. More than 1,000 miles one way. More than 10 hours in the air for the lead bombers. Longer for damaged aircraft or stragglers. LeMay studied the fuel figures and saw the truth immediately. There was no real reserve. Headwinds could kill the mission. Delays could kill the mission. Navigation errors could kill the mission. A damaged aircraft burning excess fuel might not make land at all and end up ditching into the Mediterranean. There would be no margin. LeMay briefed his crews without theatrical language. They would carry maximum fuel. They would reduce unnecessary weight where possible. They would fly exact airspeeds to optimize range. They would stay in formation because formation was not merely defensive. It also reduced drag and helped conserve fuel across the group. Every small variable mattered. And over that kind of distance, every small mistake became fatal. LeMay ended the briefing with a rule that left no room for misunderstanding. No aircraft would deviate from the planned route. No bomber would turn back early. And if an aircraft fell behind the formation, it would not be escorted home. It would be alone. There were no questions after that. The crews knew LeMay well enough to understand what his calm tone meant. He never approved a mission he believed impossible. If he said the numbers worked, then the numbers worked. They trusted his calculations. They did not trust the enemy to cooperate. But that was a different problem. The air crews preparing for the Regensburg mission were not rookies. By mid-1943, the 8th Air Force had learned its lessons the hard way. Early raids had been flown with optimistic assumptions, too little training, loose formations, and a dangerous underestimation of German defenses. The result had been brutal. Bombers shot down. Crews captured. Entire formations shattered by fighter attacks. The survivors learned quickly. They learned that the Luftwaffe never gave up a fight. They learned that anti-aircraft fire over the Ruhr could thicken the sky like a thunderstorm. They learned that cold at 23,000 feet could freeze exposed skin in minutes. They learned that oxygen systems could fail, engines could seize, and frostbite could cripple a man before a single German bullet ever reached him. By August 1943, these crews were professionals. They knew how to climb into electrically heated suits before dawn. They knew how to read the subtle changes in engine sound that warned of trouble at altitude. They knew how to clear a jammed machine gun while their fingers were numb with cold. And most importantly, they understood the roles inside the aircraft. The navigator's calculations kept them alive. The bombardier's aim made the danger worthwhile. Each man in the bomber carried a piece of the mission. LeMay walked the hard stands the night before the operation. He didn't make speeches. He simply observed. Ground crews were already working beneath the wings of the B-17s. Bombs were being hoisted carefully into the bomb bays. Fuel trucks moved from aircraft to aircraft, filling tanks with high-octane gasoline. Armorers loaded endless belts of .50 caliber ammunition into gun positions. The air smelled of oil, gasoline, and hydraulic fluid. Young mechanics moved with quiet efficiency. They had done these tasks so many times that their hands no longer needed instructions. Repetition was what kept aircraft flying. Repetition was what kept men alive. There was a stillness over the airfield. Not peace. Something heavier. The kind of silence that comes when everyone understands the odds and chooses to step forward anyway. LeMay felt it. He said nothing. Back in his quarters, he studied the route again. England. Across the Channel. Through occupied Europe. Strike Regensburg. Continue south over the Alps. Across the Mediterranean. Land in North Africa. The weather forecast predicted clear skies over the mountains. Forecasts were never guarantees. LeMay slept very little. Few commanders slept well before sending hundreds of men beyond the point of return. The mission itself was governed by physics. A B-17 Flying Fortress carried roughly 2,400 gallons of fuel. At cruising power settings, the aircraft burned around 200 gallons per hour. On paper, that meant approximately 12 hours of endurance. But combat did not happen on paper. Takeoff consumed fuel. Climbing to altitude consumed fuel. Formation maneuvering consumed fuel. Fighter attacks forced evasive action that consumed even more fuel. In reality, the maximum practical mission length for a bomber formation was 9 to 10 hours. Beyond that point, the tanks ran dry. The distance from England to Regensburg alone was nearly 450 miles. A traditional mission, out and back, would total roughly 900 miles, already pushing the limits of safe range. But Regensburg itself was only the beginning. After bombing the target, the bombers would still need to cross the Alps, where mountain peaks rose above 12,000 feet, and weather could change without warning. Then they would pass over northern Italy, still defended by German and Italian anti-aircraft guns. Finally, they would cross the Mediterranean toward airfields in Algeria and Tunisia, bases that had only recently been captured and were still barely prepared to receive hundreds of aircraft. By the time the bombers reached North Africa, they would have flown more than 1,000 miles. Total flight time would approach, or exceed, 10 hours. There was no doctrine for this kind of operation. No training manual covered it. The aircraft flight manuals did not include tables for alpine crossings or one-way strategic raids. Every calculation was done by hand, and every assumption carried consequences. LeMay and his planners began working backward from the point of fuel exhaustion. They calculated cruising speeds that would stretch the aircraft's range as far as possible. They determined altitude profiles that balanced fuel efficiency with defensive advantage. They assumed perfect navigation. They assumed favorable winds. They assumed minimal combat maneuvering. None of those assumptions were safe. But the mission had already been ordered. The numbers had to work. Weight became the enemy. Anything unnecessary was removed. Extra ammunition was reduced. Personal gear was left behind. Some aircraft even had small sections of armor removed to save precious pounds. Bomb loads were reduced slightly to allow maximum fuel capacity. Every adjustment involved a trade. Less ammunition meant weaker defense. Less armor meant greater vulnerability. But without those reductions, the aircraft simply could not reach North Africa. War was a constant negotiation between risk and necessity. Another challenge was formation integrity. American bombers survived by flying together. Each aircraft's guns overlapped with the others, creating a defensive web of firepower. Fighters attacking the formation had to face dozens of machine guns simultaneously. But a bomber flying alone was almost helpless. German pilots knew this. They ignored the main formation and hunted stragglers. A single B-17 separated from the group became an easy target. Always. Yet maintaining tight formation came with its own cost. Constant throttle adjustments burned extra fuel. Small corrections to avoid collisions increased engine consumption. On a mission with almost no fuel margin, those extra gallons could determine whether an aircraft reached North Africa or ended up ditching into the sea. LeMay ordered slightly looser formations. It reduced defensive strength, but it saved fuel. Another trade. Weather introduced still another complication. If the mission launched late, the bombers might arrive in North Africa after dark. The airfields there were not prepared for night recovery. They had no proper runway lighting, no instrument landing systems. Pilots would be forced to locate blacked-out desert airstrips by dead reckoning and hope they found them before the fuel gauges reached empty. The plan also called for two separate bomber forces. LeMay's group would strike Regensburg and continue to North Africa. A second bomber force would attack Schweinfurt, the center of German ball-bearing production, and then return to England. The two attacks would divide German defenses and complicate fighter interception. But the timing had to be exact. If the second wave was delayed, the Luftwaffe could refuel and rearm after fighting the first formation, and then intercept the second. General Eaker approved the mission with reservations. LeMay acknowledged them. He already knew the weather would not be perfect. He already knew the timing would slip. He prepared anyway. In Washington, Hap Arnold received word that the mission had been scheduled. He did not interfere. He had pushed hard for deeper raids, for proof that American bombers could reach any target in Europe. If this mission succeeded, it would validate years of strategic argument. If it failed, critics would claim the entire doctrine of daylight strategic bombing was flawed. Arnold waited. Intelligence reports arrived the night before the raid. German radar stations had detected the growing concentration of American bombers in England. The Luftwaffe knew something major was coming. They did not know where. Surprise still existed, but only barely. Before dawn, the airfields came alive. Fuel trucks made final rounds. Ground crews checked tire pressure, oil levels, and oxygen systems. Armorers inspected every machine gun. Meteorologists updated wind forecasts. Even small changes in upper-level winds could shift fuel calculations. LeMay walked toward his aircraft in the darkness. He would fly in the lead B-17. Not because he had to, because he always did. His crew moved through the checklist quietly by flashlight. One engine started, then another. Soon the entire airfield thundered with the sound of Wright Cyclone engines coming to life. More than 200 bombers roared into motion. The sound rolled across the countryside like distant thunder. There was no turning back now. The mission had not yet left the ground, but it had already begun. The first bomber lifted off shortly after 9 a.m. 30 seconds later, another followed. Then another, and another. The sky slowly filled with heavy aircraft climbing through thin clouds. Dust swirled beneath their propellers. LeMay's bomber circled over a radio beacon, waiting for the formation to assemble. Aircraft joined from every direction. Groups stacked into wings. Wings assembled into divisions. The process took time, and every minute burned fuel. 30 minutes after takeoff, the bombers were still over England forming their combat boxes. It was normal. It was also dangerous, because every minute in the air brought them closer to empty tanks. At 9:30, the formation was nearly complete. LeMay checked his watch. They were already behind schedule. The Schweinfurt force had not yet taken off. Fog and low clouds delayed their launch. Timing was slipping. LeMay had a decision to make. Wait and risk arriving over North Africa with almost no daylight, or proceed alone and allow the Luftwaffe time to recover between attacks. He considered the options for less than a minute. Fuel was not negotiable. He ordered the formation forward. The bomber stream turned southeast, and near the English coast, P-47 Thunderbolt fighters rose to meet them. For the first leg of the journey, the bombers would not be alone. But everyone in the formation understood something. Soon enough, they would be. The P-47 Thunderbolts escorting the bombers could stay with them only as long as their fuel allowed. Perhaps an hour, perhaps less. Then they would turn back. The bomber crews understood this better than anyone. It was the reality of every deep penetration raid into Germany. But on this mission, the loneliness would last far longer. The formation crossed the English Channel at nearly 23,000 feet. Outside the aircraft, the temperature hovered around 40 degrees below zero. Frost formed along window edges and gun mounts. Gunners flexed stiff fingers inside heated gloves while scanning the sky for movement. Enemy fighters usually appeared first as tiny black dots. Then they grew. Then they attacked. Below them, the channel stretched gray and restless, waves breaking into white caps that looked deceptively close. In reality, it was 4 miles down. They crossed into France. Almost immediately, the first flak bursts appeared. Black puffs bloomed in the sky like violent flowers. The bombers held course. They did not maneuver. Flak was most dangerous when formations tried to dodge it. Bombers survived by maintaining altitude and spacing, trusting discipline more than instinct. Most bursts exploded slightly above or below the formation. Some did not. Fragments tore into aluminum skin. One B-17 shuddered violently as shrapnel punctured its wing. Hydraulic lines were severed, and fuel sprayed briefly before freezing into vapor. Another bomber lost an engine. Smoke streamed behind it as the propeller feathered. The aircraft dropped slightly behind formation, but it stayed in line. The crew did not abort. Not yet. The Thunderbolts reached their fuel limit over eastern France. One by one, the fighters rocked their wings and turned west. Bomber crews watched them disappear into the distance. Now the bombers were alone. German radar had tracked the bomber stream since it crossed the coast. Fighter controllers across southern Germany were already directing interceptors into position. The Luftwaffe had time to prepare. They climbed. They formed attack groups. They waited. The first enemy fighters appeared near the German border. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s climbed toward the bomber formation from below. They did not attack immediately. They assembled. The Luftwaffe had learned its own lessons in the war. Never attack bombers individually. Mass the fighters. Strike together. Overwhelm the defenses. The attacks began near Stuttgart. German fighters dove from 12 o'clock high, the most dangerous approach angle for bombers. It was the one direction where forward defensive guns had limited coverage. Tracer fire streaked across the sky. Bombers shuddered as rounds slammed into their fuselages. American gunners opened fire. The air filled with the harsh, rattling thunder of 50 caliber machine guns. Spent shell casings piled across the floor of the waist gun positions. The smell of gunpowder filled the aircraft. One bomber took a direct hit in the cockpit. The pilot slumped forward. The co-pilot grabbed the controls, fighting to keep the aircraft level as it slid out of formation. Without the protection of the group, the bomber became a target. German fighters swarmed it. It spiraled downward, trailing smoke. No parachutes appeared. Another B-17 lost 2 engines on one wing. It could not hold altitude. The aircraft fell behind. The formation moved on. No one turned to help. A bomber alone rarely survived long. LeMay's own aircraft was hit repeatedly. Fragments tore through the wings and tail. One bullet punctured a fuel tank. The flight engineer reported the leak. LeMay made the calculation instantly. There was still enough fuel to reach the target. Enough to continue south. But now there was no reserve at all. None. The formation continued deeper into Germany. Fighter attacks kept coming. Bombers fell away. The defensive fire was strong enough to keep German pilots cautious, but not enough to stop them. The mathematics of attrition kept grinding forward. The Luftwaffe could break off, land, rearm, and climb again. The bombers could not stop. They could only continue. Soon Regensburg appeared ahead. Industrial buildings clustered along the Danube River. Anti-aircraft fire intensified immediately. The bombers entered the flak zone. The most dangerous part of the mission. Bomb bay doors opened. The aircraft held perfectly steady. Bombardiers leaned over their Norden bomb sights, making final corrections. Altitude steady. Airspeed steady. Formation steady. The bomb run lasted less than 2 minutes. But inside the bombers it felt endless. Then the bombs released. The aircraft lurched upward, suddenly lighter. Behind them, explosions blossomed across the factory complex. Smoke began to rise. The Messerschmitt plant had been hit. But no one celebrated. The mission was only half finished. The bomber stream turned south. Ahead of them stood the Alps. Fuel gauges were already falling toward empty. They crossed into Austria, climbing toward the Brenner Pass. Snow-covered peaks rose sharply on either side. The bombers were above the mountains. But not by much. Any aircraft with serious damage, any bomber burning excess fuel, would fail to clear the mountains. Some did. A few turned back toward Germany, hoping to find somewhere flat enough for an emergency landing. Most of those crews were captured. Others were killed. The rest of the formation pressed forward. Northern Italy passed beneath them. Then the Mediterranean Sea appeared. The fuel gauges were deep in the red now. Pilots leaned their engines carefully, reducing power to stretch every possible mile. Some crews manually transferred fuel between tanks. Others shut down damaged engines and prayed the remaining ones would carry them far enough. Engines began coughing. One by one the bombers began descending toward North Africa. Land appeared through the haze. The airfields were somewhere ahead. But if a pilot missed the field, there would be no fuel left to search for another. LeMay's navigator confirmed the final heading. The formation descended. Engines sputtered. Some bombers landed with less than 10 minutes of fuel remaining. Others rolled onto the runway with engines dying completely. In the end, 122 B-17s reached North Africa. 24 had been lost over Germany. Others were scattered, damaged, or forced to ditch. LeMay climbed down from his bomber and lit a cigar. His face showed no emotion. The mission had worked. Barely. The airfields at Tallergma and Bonn were not prepared for what followed. More than 100 battered B-17s arrived nearly empty of fuel, many carrying wounded men and severe battle damage. The bases were primitive. Dirt runways, temporary steel matting, few fuel trucks, minimal medical facilities. The idea of turning the bombers around within 24 hours, the original plan, suddenly seemed impossible. Yet the ground crews began working immediately. Wounded airmen were carried out first. Medics moved through aircraft searching for injuries not reported during flight. Some gunners had been unconscious from blood loss or oxygen deprivation for hours. Others had wounds frozen closed by the extreme cold at altitude. Now, in the heat of North Africa, the bleeding began again. Medical tents filled quickly. Maintenance crews inspected the aircraft. Bullet holes were counted, not for record-keeping, but to determine whether the aircraft could fly again. Hydraulic leaks were patched. Tires shredded by flak were replaced if spares existed. Engines that had lost oil were examined. Some bombers were simply too damaged. They would remain behind. Fuel quickly became the biggest problem. The tanker trucks could not keep up. In some cases, fuel had to be pumped by hand from barrels. The heat was brutal. Temperatures climbed above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet the ground crews worked through the afternoon, through the evening, through the night. Pilots and co-pilots joined them. Everyone helped. There was no other choice. LeMay walked the flight line again. He made quiet notes. Which aircraft could fly tomorrow? Which crews were too badly shaken or wounded to continue? He did not ask how they felt. He asked one question instead. Can you do it again? Most answered yes. Some lied. LeMay knew they were lying. He accepted it anyway. Reports were sent back to England that evening. The mission had succeeded. The target had been struck. The shuttle concept had worked. Losses were high, but within what planners called acceptable limits. A phrase that meant something very different to the men who had flown the mission. In Washington, Hap Arnold read the report carefully. Then he called Ira Eaker. Only one question mattered. Can it be done again? Eaker answered cautiously. The fuel situation in North Africa was fragile. The Luftwaffe now knew the bombers had landed there. The element of surprise was gone. But yes, perhaps once, perhaps twice more. Arnold did not celebrate. He saw the mission for what it really was. Proof that range was not fixed. Proof that doctrine could stretch. Proof that air power still had possibilities no one had fully explored. Then he returned to his desk and began drafting another memo. One about something even more important. Long-range fighter escort. Because the shuttle raid had bought time. But it had not solved the real problem. Meanwhile, in England, the 2nd Bomber Force finally launched hours late. They attacked Schweinfurt and turned back toward England. By then the Luftwaffe had already refueled and reorganized after fighting LeMay's formation. They were waiting. The Schweinfurt raid faced massive coordinated fighter attacks. 36 bombers were shot down. More than 15% of the force. Entire groups were shattered. Crews that survived landed in England stunned, not by fear, but by arithmetic. If every mission cost this much, there would be no crews left by winter. When the two operations were analyzed together, the conclusion was unavoidable. The shuttle raid had worked. The conventional deep raid had been a disaster. And the lesson was clear. Without long-range fighter escort, the 8th Air Force would eventually bleed itself dry trying to bomb Germany. The Regensburg shuttle mission delayed an uncomfortable truth. It did not eliminate it. Hap Arnold understood this clearly. In fact, he had known it for months. The mission proved that American bombers could reach targets deep inside Germany, targets previously considered safe behind distance and geography. But it also confirmed something equally important. Such missions could not be sustained indefinitely, not without fighters that could escort the bombers all the way to the target and back again. In North Africa, the bombers were already being prepared for the return leg. Fuel trucks crawled along dusty airstrips, topping off tanks that had nearly run dry only hours earlier. Bombs were loaded again. Mechanics patched bullet holes with whatever metal they could find. Engines that had barely survived the journey from Germany were inspected with exhausted concentration. By dawn, the aircraft were ready. LeMay gathered the crews for another briefing. The next mission would strike targets in southern France on the way back to England. The men were exhausted. They had flown 10 hours across Europe and the Mediterranean. They had slept poorly in unfamiliar desert heat. And now they were expected to climb back into their aircraft and do it again. No one protested. Engines started. Propellers blurred into motion. And the bomber formations assembled once more. The shuttle mission was not over yet. The aircraft lifted off heading north. Behind them, the desert stretched endlessly. Ahead of them waited Europe again. Meanwhile, the German reaction to the Regensburg raid unfolded in stages. First came confusion. Radar stations had tracked the American bombers approaching Germany from the west. Fighter controllers had directed interceptors into battle. Everything had followed familiar patterns. The bombers had fought their way to the target. They had taken losses. They had bombed the factory. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of turning west toward England, the bomber stream turned south. At first, German controllers assumed it was deception, perhaps a feint designed to divide fighter defenses. But the bombers continued south, across the Alps, beyond radar coverage. Gone. Reports soon arrived from observers in Italy. American bombers were flying south across the Mediterranean. The realization came slowly. Then all at once, the bombers had not returned to England. They had landed in North Africa. The implications were immediate. If American bombers could stage from bases in North Africa, then the entire geography of German air defense had changed overnight. Targets in southern Germany, Austria, and the Balkans were no longer protected by distance. Previously, the Luftwaffe had concentrated defenses against approaches from the west and northwest. Now they had to defend against threats from the south as well. Fighter units were repositioned. Radar coverage was expanded wherever possible. But German resources were limited. Every fighter squadron moved south left fewer aircraft defending the Reich from attacks out of England. Every radar station relocated created new gaps elsewhere. The Regensburg mission had not destroyed massive infrastructure, but it had forced the German defense system to reconsider its assumptions. Adolf Hitler was briefed. He demanded to know how American bombers had crossed the Alps and reached North Africa without being destroyed. The answers were frustrating. The bombers had been intercepted. They had suffered heavy losses, but the Americans had simply continued. This was the part that troubled German planners the most. The Americans were willing to accept losses to achieve strategic goals. That willingness suggested a depth of resources and determination that could not easily be countered. In Washington, Arnold studied intelligence summaries describing the German reaction: fighter units shifting, defenses stretching, radar systems repositioning. The shuttle mission had achieved something larger than the destruction of one factory. It had forced the enemy to defend possibilities instead of certainties. That was the leverage Arnold had hoped for. Not just bombs on a target, but disruption of the enemy's entire defensive system. Arnold drafted a memorandum to his staff. The Regensburg shuttle had proven that operational range could be extended through logistics and careful planning. But the cost had been high. Future shuttle missions should only be conducted when their strategic value justified the risk. And the mission had reinforced something even more urgent: the need for long-range escort fighters. Until that capability existed, deep penetration raids would remain dangerous and expensive. Arnold rarely used the word unsustainable, but privately he understood the danger. The 8th Air Force was losing experienced crews faster than they could be replaced. New crews arrived with limited training. Many were shot down on their first missions. The loss rate was not just a statistic. It was a slow erosion of capability. An Air Force could grow larger on paper, while becoming weaker in reality. Help was coming, but not yet. The P-51 Mustang, fitted with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, was in development. It had the range and performance needed to escort bombers deep into Germany. But in late 1943, it was still arriving in small numbers. It would take months before the aircraft appeared in strength. Until then, the bombers would continue flying largely alone, and the losses would continue. Back in England, General Ira Eaker received instructions to prepare additional shuttle missions when possible. He remained cautious. The strain on North African bases was enormous. Fuel and ammunition had to be diverted from other operations. Aircraft required repairs. Crews were exhausted. The system simply could not support such missions regularly. Eaker agreed to plan for more shuttle raids, but he knew they would never become routine. LeMay and his crews eventually returned to England after completing the return strike in southern France. The journey back was quieter. Luftwaffe fighters appeared less frequently. Perhaps they were conserving strength. Perhaps they were repositioning to defend new approaches. When the bombers landed, the losses were fewer than expected. LeMay completed his report with characteristic simplicity. The mission had been feasible, but it was not something that could be repeated regularly. He recommended the shuttle concept remain an option, not standard doctrine. Arnold read LeMay's report carefully. He underlined a single word: option. That was the true value of the shuttle mission. Not a replacement for existing strategy, but an expansion of what was possible. In war, possibilities were a form of currency. If you could strike from unexpected directions, at unexpected times, the enemy had to defend everywhere. And when an enemy defended everywhere, he weakened everywhere. The Regensburg shuttle raid faded quickly from headlines. By September, the air war had moved on. More raids, more losses, more targets deeper inside Germany. But inside planning rooms, something had changed. The assumption that bombers must always return to their original base was no longer absolute. A mission could be designed around range and destination, not simply range and return. That realization opened new possibilities, new target sets, new approaches, new confusion for enemy defenses. Arnold did not celebrate. Instead, he pushed harder. He accelerated deployment of the P-51 Mustang. He demanded more bombers, more crews, more missions. The shuttle raid had proven that logistics could stretch range. But Arnold knew the real solution was simpler. Fighters that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. When that capability arrived in 1944, the air war changed dramatically. LeMay himself would go on to command massive bombing campaigns in the Pacific. The lessons he had applied over Germany, fuel discipline, formation control, long-range planning, would shape those operations as well. The Regensburg mission was only a footnote in his career, but within that footnote were the seeds of everything that followed. A willingness to accept calculated risk, a refusal to treat doctrine as a movable law, and the belief that war was a problem to be solved, not a script to be followed. The crews who flew the mission rarely spoke about it later. For them it was just one raid among many, distinguished by distance, not by fear. Fear was constant. So was exhaustion. Some completed their tours. Others did not. Years later, historians would debate the mission's value. If measured by factories destroyed, the results were modest. If measured by disruption to German defenses and doctrinal innovation, the impact was significant. If measured by the men lost, the cost was absolute. Arnold later defended the bomber offensive in his writings. He acknowledged the losses, but he argued that strategic bombing shortened the war and saved lives that might otherwise have been lost in prolonged ground fighting. The Regensburg mission stood quietly within that argument. Proof that air power could adapt. Proof that it could reach farther than anyone expected. The deeper lesson of the shuttle mission was simple. Operational limits are often assumptions. Fuel range, escort radius, crew endurance. All can be stretched if the planning is rigorous enough. The mission succeeded because someone asked a question that doctrine had never considered. What if the bombers didn't turn back? The answer was 1,000 miles of sky, 10 hours in the air, and a new understanding of what was possible. The air war over Europe would continue for 2 more brutal years. Bombers would reach Berlin, Ploiești, Dresden, and countless other cities. Escort fighters would eventually arrive. Loss rates would shift from catastrophic to sustainable. The 8th Air Force would grow into the largest aerial armada ever assembled. But its transformation began with missions like Regensburg. Missions where crews flew beyond the edge of the possible and returned with proof. Arnold never described the mission as easy. He never pretended it came without cost. But when asked whether it mattered, his answer was simple. It worked. And in war, that is often the only verdict that counts. The shuttle mission proved something fundamental. Distance is not merely a barrier of geography. It is a problem of planning. Courage without calculation is waste. Air power is not only bombs and guns, but fuel, navigation, timing, and the willingness to challenge what manuals declare impossible. The sky is not a wall. It is a medium, and those who understand it will always reach farther than those who do not.